Well, in Nairobi, Kenya, heavy gunfire sent journalists and civilians scrambling for a third day in a row as government forces squared off with Al-Shabab militants at a local mall. The gunfight started Saturday afternoon at the Westgate Shopping Mall, where a group of 10 to 15 militants walked in two entrances and began firing on shoppers. The Kenyan Red Cross says that at least 62 people have been killed and 175 others have been injured, including 5 Americans. Al-Shabab posted a list of 9 people it says took part in the mall attack. 3 of those people are American citizens. It's a claim that the FBI is currently investigating, but lawmakers are already alarmed about Al-Shabab's influence in the United States.
It's an extremely deadly organization, very well trained, and it's one of the only Al-Qaeda affiliates which actually has actively recruited here in the United States. There's at least 40 to 50 Somali Americans have gone from the United States to Somalia to be trained. A number of them have been killed, but there's others still alive. So I would assume that the FBI and local law enforcement are looking into those Somali American communities today for any leads or indicators, using all their sources and resources to make sure that there's no follow-up attempt here in the United States.
I spoke earlier with Hani Almadhoun, a writer at HuffingtonPost.com, who went into more detail about Al-Shabab and the threats the group poses to American interests.
It's essentially a group of extremists, started as an extremist group that didn't have a militant strategy at first, but then when they recruited their group, they took advantage of the power vacuum in Somalia, and then they started recruiting locally. And after the war in Somalia, a lot of Somalis left around the world to be safer in Nigeria and around Africa. A lot of them came to the United States and Europe, and they've built these strong communities. A lot of them are successful people who are part of the communities where they live. However, some of them, they still maintain ties to back home, and they see the tragedies back home and all the drama, and they try to blame it around the powers of the world. And then you see few cases of them, they get recruited and they feel animated to defend the homeland. And, you know, as we know that there is the global jihad network that's happy to pick any recruit. And for them, the Somalis seem to be a perfect constituency because they have the drive. And essentially, there's a lot of brainwashing, there's a lot of victimization going on. And for that, they managed to succeed locally and essentially be a threat to their neighbors in Africa and some parts of the Arab world.
And as I understand it, one of the fundamentals of this Al-Shabaab group is global jihad. That's seriously what they've been preaching in recent years. Can you talk about this in a little bit more broad context? Because a lot of people tend to equate Al-Qaeda with some of these other terroristic organizations, but there are similarities and also differences. Am I correct?
Essentially, you are correct. The reality is the Shabab is not a one group. There are more than one group and faction among them. Essentially, there is the international leg of the Shabab movement, which is the link to Al-Qaeda and the Zawahiri, and they are part of the global jihad. They have a lineage to Somalia, but a lot of them are more, they pledge allegiance to the Al-Qaeda and their methods, and usually they are violent methods, as we see. But there are also the local ones who care about the local government and services and things like that. They're still extremists, not necessarily as violent. And in the past, throughout this year, there was an inner struggle between the two factions of the group, and the reality ended by the international faction of Al-Shabab is now essentially in control. And to the local communities in Somalia, they know these guys are just imports. They're not really from the community. They're just there to cause shenanigans and make the place a tougher place to live. And the local government is trying to work against them with coalition with other countries. As you see, Kenya has the buffer zone in southern Somalia, and that's sort of supported by the world community just because they do want to spill over into the African region. And the African command, the United States command in Africa is really keeping a close tab at these groups. We don't hear much of their action, but there's a lot of activities in Yemen. They hunt some of their leaders in Yemen. And that's one of the issues that the U.S. has been very active on. As far as domestically, I know the United States here will be stepping up their game against these groups here and their local recruits in places wherever they have their communities, like in Minnesota or Oregon. and they will be doing a lot of wiretapping and things to just make sure they prevent these things from happening. Especially any domestic threat would be a major concern for the United States.
And Hani, I'm glad you brought that up, this domestic issue, because as you say, they have influence locally and internationally, but they also have influence right here in the United States. I know Peter King just mentioned that. So can you talk about the influence that they have within the United States, how large it is, and should American citizens be concerned that this means more security, more surveillance?
And that's a legitimate question. The reality is there is a large community of Somalis. I once flew to Minnesota through the airport, and everyone essentially is from Somalia. They're hardworking people. They're lovely. They smile. They live the American dream. However, you have people living in the margin who really think like, oh, the motherland is struggling. We need to make this right. But these people, usually they're not very successful in their life, and they just pick up terrorism and they pick extremism. They spend a great time at the local mosque with the wrong people, and then they get brainwashed. But the greater Somali community is a very affluent community here in the United States. But again, the NSA and other entities in the United States would be happy to use that as an excuse to do more surveillance on the people, and there is ground to actually spy or monitor these activities. As we know, the New York police is very active in this front. There is the CIA. There's a lot of people there is a lot at stake here, and I think the Shabab is a perfect group for them to go after, especially because there is networks here. And I believe that the Oregon bomber a few years ago at the Christmas tree, he had some links to the Al-Shabab group, and that's one of the biggest concern was at the time. But now I think as more time goes and they step up their game in the international stage, now they attack the mall in Kenya, and that causes a lot of people to raising questions.
And I know one of the biggest things that really stuck out to me when I was reading and researching about Al-Shabaab was that last week a report filed in a court case in New York's Eastern District alleged that Al-Shabaab is or was recently operating a research and development department in order to research and obtain chemical weapons. Now, how credible is this threat? Should Americans be worried, given the volatility in the region, given the volatility in Syria, that these people could actually get their hands on chemical weapons?
I mean, as far as the Somali community, they sort of like, look at the language. They don't speak Arabic. They're not very, they are Arabic by name, but they feel allegiance to the Arab world, but they're a little bit away from that community. And the concern is Syria. If Syria goes, the situation goes south, there's a lot of stockpiles of weapons that you would not be able to count. And, there are bidders who buy these weapons and transport it to another place, and then boom, you get some major weapons. The Shabab has it. And, chemical weapons don't really take much space to operate. They just, you don't need to have training. It's essentially something that could be conducted in a small operation, and that will provide for them supplies for arms and weapons. And I think that's one of the biggest concerns for the United States. Not necessarily that they like what the regime is doing in Syria, but they fear the day after what will happen with all these weapons. I mean, look at the Libyan scenario. There's a lot of worries for weapons leaked out of that country and going to the wrong places. And that's why essentially the United States refused to provide arms. In publicity stunt, they said, yes, they will give them arms, but in reality, they have not given them arms just because they don't know where these weapons will end. It's not like they're going to vanish after Assad after the regime in Syria falls, if it does.
That was Hani Almadhoun, writer at thehuffingtonpost.com.